Good evening, folks. I am James Russell, and I work in Renaissance Studies. Now, the proper term for someone in my field is a Renaissanciste. But I think using that word is a bit like calling a busboy a plongeur, which is the job I do to support my PhD in the humanities. Je suis un plongeur étudiante. And if the PowerPoint could forward. So I'm writing up my PhD. I'm in the last few months, which means I want to procrastinate. But when I procrastinate, I choose to go on Twitter. Why, oh why, does Twitter exist? I get to find out things like what Stephen Fry had for breakfast, or what color pants Miranda Hart wears. And the beautiful and awful thing about Twitter is that people post things without thinking. It's like their thought goes from their brain to their hands without those nasty inhibitions getting in the way. You get people's unfiltered, candid, honest thoughts proclaimed to the world. So what I work on is the Renaissance equivalent of Twitter, which is the notes that people wrote in the margins of books. Now, when we think of the Renaissance and its great scholars and artists, we think of the end product, the sculptures, the paintings, the literature. But we know very little about the nitty-gritty of the creative process. What was behind these works? What were they thinking while they made them? I look at the books that inspired them, and looked at their notes that they made to see what they were thinking. One of the incredible things about Twitter is that people can post their thoughts in real time. So earlier this week, at the same time, thousands of people all across the world shared the same thought that Carlos Tevez is a twat. So what I'm doing now is following people, reading in real time, and looking at what they put. Now, these notes are very candid. People are putting their honest thoughts without thinking about their public image. And this is a powerful insight. In history, we usually get the official story, not the underground story. It's much like today. If you were to look at the mainstream media, it would portray that we're all just sort of resignedly accepting these cuts. But if you look at the notes people write in the margins, you get a different story. These notes are called marginalia, in the sense, on the margins. So I'm looking at notes in a book with the long, unpronounceable title of Hypnerotomachia Polyphily, which means The Strife of Love and the Dream of Polyphilo. It's a very seminal work. It's the second most valuable book in the rare book market after a first edition Gutenberg Bible. But no one quite knows what it was for, why it was written. It's the inspiration behind many artworks, but it's written in a made-up language. It's kind of a bizarre love story. And it's a dream. It's in the same sort of genre as A Midsummer Night's Dream. So, let's practice pronouncing it together. It comes from the Greek roots, hypnos, sleep, eroto, love, machia, the strife of love in a dream of he who loves many things. So are we ready, children? Follow the bouncing ball. Hypneroto, machia. The rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain. Polyphily. Now, this was a work that was a great inspiration. It inspired Gian Lorenzo Bernini's sculpture, Pulcino della Minerva, with the amazing artistic concept of an elephant impaled by an obelisk. It's also been argued that it was an inspiration behind the Gardens of Versailles. But we know that the book was the source of the ideas. But how did people and artists like Bernini think through the book as they were creating these pieces? We know it from their notes. As I said, it was a love story. It's kind of like if the Encyclopedia Britannica was written by Mills and Boon. Someone took a very eroto machia, but used that as the narrative framework to include information on everything a Renaissance scholar is supposed to know, from gemology through botany to the fine points of Latin grammar. So what I do is I look at these notes, I transcribe them, and there's also often several annotators in one book. It's like an archaeologist digging down through several layers of a dig. You can look at the opinions people shared over time. This, in fact, is the playwright Ben Jonson's notes. Now, a book like this, it's, as I said, it's bizarre. No one quite knows what it's for. And rather than speculating about what its intent was, I look at how people used it. Sometimes, more interesting than a book is the way people interpreted it, the way communities made sense of this. It's called reception theory. In a sense, the Hypnerotomachia is sort of like a Rorschach test. It doesn't really matter what the ink blots are intended to mean. They have no intent. It's what the real evidence we're looking for is what you project onto that image. And if you were to say something like, I see the splattered blood of dead psychologists, you could probably presume there was something wrong with that person. So looking at the concepts that people projected onto the strife of love and a dream gives us a good sense of what was going through the mind of Renaissance scholars. One group of people who annotated this book were alchemists. Now, when we look back at alchemy, we say, this is a ridiculous concept. It's completely it's a waste of time to study. But it was a very necessary stage in the evolution of science. It was actually an internally consistent theoretical framework for understanding a certain range of phenomena. Though, when we look back at the recipes and say, if you take sulfur and lead, put them together in a furnace, you'll get gold, it makes about as much sense as saying, if we cut public services and cut corporate taxes, somehow the economy is going to get better. From an invisible hand. But we know very little about the alchemical process, and since this is a necessary stage in the evolution of science, by looking at the notes of alchemists, we get a very close view into this period we couldn't otherwise get. Now, why were they annotating the Hypnotomachia? Well, there was a concept in the 16th and 17th centuries called the Prisca Sapientia, the ancient wisdom. The idea was that the world had been going into hell in a handbasket since antiquity. So the way to get the world back into rights was to look for the most ancient texts which were least likely to be corrupted by modernity. That meant the texts that were most illegible, most obscure, most bizarre. Texts like the Hypnotomachia. So according to this logic, the Tory Party manifesto would be like the Analects of Confucius. And because of this Prisca Sapientia, this book has got a certain mystique. There was kind of a Da Vinci Code rip-off novel written about the Hypnotomachia called The Rule of Four, which is about a grad student who decides to do his PhD on this and ends up being chased by a conspiracy. I'm really, really waiting for this conspiracy because writing up is dead dull. I spend all day long in front of my computer screen. So if I got agents from an ancient secret society chasing me, that would really brighten up my life. So if any of you have contacts in the Illuminati, please stick them on me. It would make my experience so much better. But over time, we get to see how alchemy evolved. It started as a physical science, but when they realized that it didn't literally work, alchemy evolved into more of a symbolic system, a system of allegories in which to understand our own spiritual development, that the furnace is the trials we endure, and the elements are the parts of our lives, and together they make the gold of our better self. It's a bit like grad school. If you throw us into the furnace of no funding, no time, and endless constant pressure, somehow we're expected to produce, by some kind of alchemy, the outcome of a PhD. So I hope that I end up showing you that these notes in the margins are not vandalism. They're actually a very useful source. And I'd encourage you to do the same. Grad students in the humanities really need employment. And there's a saying that vandalism, once it turns about 100 years old, becomes artifacts. So I brought some pens with me. I'd like to give them to you, and I'd like you to go to the local public library tomorrow and vandalize these books. Mark them up, write all over them, because you'll be providing a very useful source for the historians of the future of the thought process of the early 20th and 21st century. If you were to go back to my old school books, you'd be able to reconstruct a lot about me at age 10. You'd see R.I.P. Kurt Cobain, you'd see I Heart Liz Phair, you'd see a little animated flip movie of a guy's head exploding in the corners. And you could reconstruct a lot about me. So I'd like to hand you these pens. Please go forth and vandalize and give us all jobs. Thank you so much.